Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We've got a lot to get to on this Monday edition of the Lions 24/7 podcast. We brought a post-game edition to you as usual, coming out of Beaver Stadium on Saturday. If you missed that, we had about 50 minutes or so between myself and Daniel Gallen discussing a 34-27 victory for the number 8 Nittany Lions over Bowling Green. We're going to get into takeaways from that matchup. We're going to start to set the stage for what this bye week represents for Penn State, their first of 2 bye weeks on the 2024 schedule, by bringing in Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, my colleagues at Lions 24/7, the guys I sit next to in the Beaver Stadium press box. And you folks already heard from me and Daniel. Aside from being tremendously handsome, the three of us have another thing in common. We all picked Penn State to cover a 5-touchdown spread against Bowling Green. So we're all wearing some egg on our face. We're not alone on this Monday coming out of this matchup. But Mark, we lead with you on these Mondays because we don't have you on the post-game show. Your general initial takeaways from what you witnessed on Saturday afternoon in the home opener.
For the record, I'm the one who predicted Jack Lambert would play at quarterback. So, and I think if it had been a blowout, I might have been right? I mean, but obviously it wasn't. But to me, that looked more like an opening game, right? What you would expect from an opening game as opposed to West Virginia, where I thought Penn State was pretty crisp and pretty tight. I mentioned it. There's an old coaching saying that says you make the most progress between the most improvement between the first game and the second game. And to me, this kind of reverse that. And, with respect to the defense, they do so little tackling now in the preseason that you almost expect there to be tackling issues again in the first game. We didn't see that, but we really saw it in the first half. I mean, I know James Franklin talked about guys were trying to make too many plays, and that was accurate. I mean, guys were trying to do too much, but by the same token, you can't excuse the poor tackling that they had in the first half. To their credit, they tightened it all up in the second half, only allowed 80-some yards and played really well. But that first half, to me, I mean, that was the tricky part that I saw. I was just a little bit surprised that after we saw them play so cleanly against West Virginia on both sides of the ball, really, that it wasn't quite there. The offense, to me, it was more of an up and down thing. The defense was a tale of two halves. The offense, I think, is playing well overall, but in this game, just kind of fits and starts. And I think they have to find that level of consistency. And then the other thing I would say is, they clearly have established who their top playmakers are. And they're the people who we knew they were going to be, or had suspected they were going to be. I think they have to do a better job now of spreading the wealth offensively. We know what Tyler Warren's all about. I mean, awesome game, most yards ever for a Penn State tight end in a single game, which is saying something. I mean, because they've had great tight ends, and you're talking about a game where they only passed it 20 times. So this wasn't some, wild shootout where they're throwing 70 times and your tight ends building up those numbers. To do it on 8 targets, I mean, unbelievable. 7 of those going for first downs, catches on all 8 of the targets. And then obviously Katron Allen comes through with a big game. Nick Singleton comes through with a big game. I think now they have to start spreading the wealth a little bit offensively. So those are some of the quick things that kind of stood out to me.
We've got a lot to dive into from that matchup too, and including kind of counter to what you said, where you think we know who the top playmakers are. Will we see the top playmakers, to produce consistently, where Harrison Wallace goes for 100 plus and then he's not in the box score the next week? We'll talk about some of that receiver use in general and what stood out to us from game snaps and further reflection on the win. But Daniel, let's go over to players of the game, because the Penn State coaching staff now puts these out on Sunday. It gives us a chance to work our way through that, to see what they thought about the top performers in each phase of the game from the game before here on Mondays. Tyler Warren, we'll go over more details there a little bit later and what's going on in the tight end room. Mark just made the case for him. 7 of those 8 catches went for first downs. He was tremendous all afternoon. 4 of them came in the first half, 4 after the second half. So in a game where it was a little topsy-turvy, Tyler Warren was Mr. Consistent. But defensively, it's Zane Durant and the interior of that defensive line, and special teams, it's Sander Sahadak, who, as we said at the tail end of our post-game podcast, those points that he put on the board proved to be a lot more meaningful than we would have anticipated against Bowling Green.
Yeah, I think anytime you see these players of the game from the staff, it provides a little bit of a window into their thinking and lets us look at things from a different view to see how maybe the staff is looking at it. especially when you get to something like defense and special teams. I know that we talked about it in the post game where um, we talked about in the post game where I didn't have a defensive player of the game when we were late in that game. I was going to punt on it. I wasn't going to give one. I was just going to say like more than the sum of their parts, et cetera, et cetera. But eventually a couple big plays here and there, and I got to one. Now, Zane Durant had one tackle, but then you look into those PFF grades, you look a little bit deeper down, and he gets he was the highest greatest PFF player, and you knew that he was making things happen inside. So that was interesting to me. I know that people put different stock in PFF grades in different ways, but Durant is someone who's had a really good start to this year, and I've been impressed with him. As for Zahadak, like it's Sanders Zahadak. You needed to see that from him. He delivered. Riley Thompson picked up some recognition from the Ray Guy Award today for his day. I thought his 56-yard punt towards the sideline, caught in the air with absolutely no chance of return, was really, really impressive. But yeah, I think those three players of the game. I think Durant probably surprised me a little bit, but that's just coming out of being in the press box, not having that chance to go back, review different things, but it's probably very well deserved.
Yeah, I think if folks are gonna go hop into the box score from Saturday, they may work their way down for a while till they get to Zane Durant. He had one tackle on the day; it was a tackle for loss. But on the afternoon, he had three pressures that he was credited with that actually led the entire Penn State defense. They didn't have a ton of them. This was an offense that was getting the ball out of the hands of its quarterback very quickly. That was working for them well. It didn't result in a lot of pressures. No sacks on the day for Penn State's defense, but he was disruptive on the interior, able to make a bit of an impact there from penetrating. And he had the top overall run defensive grade in terms of PFF, handing those out after the game to Nittany Lions defenders. So sometimes with these linemen, you got to look behind the surface level stats to the impact. And I think Durant's a good illustration of that for what he did in week 2. We talked a lot about it with Zahadak, but I don't think we're going to be discussing him much or dwelling on that much, Mark. But last time we had you on the show, we were all kind of wondering, and we said they could go out and win by those 5 touchdowns. But if along the way Zahadak struggles, that's going to be a talking point. Do you think this is still a talking point going into the bye week, or does Zahadak settle down some of that noise here for at least the time being?
I think he benefited the most from that game. I think the fact that, I mean, if you're a Penn State fan, you don't want to see the game that close. But if you're a Sanders Zahadak fan, you wanted to see him get an opportunity in a game that mattered. So he ends up scoring 10 points in that game, 4 extra points and 2 field goals, and that's a 7-point game. So what more could you really ask for? And one of them was a 43-yarder that wasn't necessarily easy. So from his perspective, I think he kind of hammered that down. He obviously did a good enough job in the preseason that they were confident in him. And I mentioned it last week. I'm really glad they stuck with him, because we've seen this kid and heard this kid. We've heard what the ball is like coming off of his foot. He's got a tremendously powerful leg, and they won't spend a scholarship on a kid unless he has that kind of talent. He just needed to prove it in a game, and I think the fact that he did it in a game kind of puts that to rest for now. But with any kicker, you're only as good as your last game. So he's going to have to go out and prove it over and over again. But I think the fact that he was able to get that in his back pocket was big.
The number 1 overall kicker prospect in 24/7 Sports 2021 rankings. He hadn't converted a field goal in a game since 2022 until this last Saturday. He'll look to build off of that one when Penn State comes out of the bye week. He is a redshirt junior right now as Sanders Zahadak trying to emerge and hold on to this job throughout the 2024 season. Let's go backward and talk about Saturday's matchup before we look forward and talk about this gap in Penn State's schedule and how they can benefit and some of the questions or concerns that we have lingering out of the first couple games. And I think this one was really defined, Daniel, by an uncharacteristically sloppy, kind of unaccountable performance from the Penn State defense through the first half of this matchup. I referenced the statistic a couple times on our post-game show. Bowling Green posts 17 points before Penn State runs its 10th offensive play. And so I'm not looking at the Penn State offense here and saying, you guys didn't show up for this matchup. I'm looking towards the defense and saying, what exactly went down this week? Because it was such a buttoned-up group against West Virginia. There were people going into that matchup raving about who Garrett Green could be that Saturday, who he could be over the course of the season, a dynamic threat. Didn't happen at all against these Nittany Lions. And then you go and see Bowling Green's far under the radar quarterback look like a Heisman Trophy candidate for the first couple quarters in Beaver Stadium.
Yeah, that was something I was really not expecting to see from Penn State. The more that you sit with it since Saturday, I mean, I think you have to give Tom Allen and the players some credit for whatever they did to adjust at halftime. And the players were giving Tom Allen a lot of credit. It felt like after the game for his demeanor and how he approached that whole situation. I do think that giving up 24 points in the first half to Bowling Green and not having those, quote unquote adjustments come until you've given up that many points, that's something that maybe you raise your eyebrows at a little bit as you move forward. But we just haven't seen the defense play like that in a really, really long time. Outside of the Peach Bowl, probably not since that Michigan game in 2022. Just to see them get gashed like that and to make it look easy was just something very, very uncharacteristic. And this is the type of thing where maybe you say, okay, this might be good for them to get that kind of impact, to have this kind of performance on tape, to have these real tangible things to improve on instead of maybe things at the margins that maybe you get after a big win like the West Virginia game. I'm interested to see how they spin this moving forward. But if Bowling Green can put 24 points up on you in a half with a performance like that, when you're deeper into that Big Ten schedule, if you play like that against USC, some of these other teams, you might not be able to make that up.
Mark, I'm going to turn this to you in just a moment, but I did think it was telling how many of those players after the matchup discussed directly what Tom Allen kind of dealt with during the halftime performance. It didn't sound like it was a guy who was screaming, hooting and hollering to get his message across. I don't know if he had much of a voice left. He usually doesn't when we get a chance to speak with Tom Allen. But in this case, I think I said on the postgame podcast, Abdul Carter said he learned something about Tom Allen and how he's going to stand up in a little bit of adversity there when you give up 24 points at home as the heavy favorite to Bowling Green. Something else that we heard, though, from Kobe King, who I'm going to trust about as much as anybody in terms of their opinion of this Penn State defense and how it's operating. He's the guy wearing the helmet communications piece. He's the guy who's a team captain for that group as the Mike linebacker. And he flat out said very fast when I asked him, it was an effort adjustment coming out of halftime, not a schematical adjustment. And I think when you go back and view what happened in first half, second half, it is a lot about filling the right gaps, finding the right fits in the run game. It's about the communication being much better. I mean, I don't know if you guys noticed this in the press box. There were times when guys were, trying to motion and get attention for their teammates and get them a message across while Bowling Green snapping the football. And so all that stuff going on in the first half, it's no wonder. It just really was confusion was kind of the defining factor for that group. And that got worse when KJ Winston exited. And yet they come out, didn't see a lot of schematic overhaul from Tom Allen's bunch. And you actually didn't see a lot of different players on the field versus the first half, Mark. But what they did was they were gap accountable. They were playing with a lot more consideration, I think, in the backfield defensively for how they were handling players downfield, inside leverage versus outside leverage, knowing when to hand a player off to your safety, outside linebackers and safeties working off each other. These things were just exploited time and time again in the first half. And I think to Daniel's point, you got to go back to when Michigan took them to the woodshed in Ann Arbor, Manny Diaz's first season, and that was kind of a pivot point for that defense. It felt like the first half was similar because they just didn't have solutions. And it seems like the players are taking a lot of ownership for how it went down.
I don't know about you guys, but it looked to me like they took an opponent lightly, right?
I mean, we did. Yeah. I mean, we should probably start there. We talked about the human nature, the psychology that goes to it, especially with college football. I don't know if we can say the whole team didn't prepare accordingly, but I think we can probably say defensively, it just they were not ready to be held accountable, and that was clear the entire first half.
And Bowling Green, unlike West Virginia, wasn't yapping before the game. They went on the field and did their talking on the field. Bazelak, give him credit. He played a year under Tom Allen at Indiana, and he probably had a good feel for what he was going to see. He made some unbelievable throws. I mean, that touchdown pass when Dom DeLuca hit him was unbelievable. I mean, that was just a great play. So they were playing at a different level than we saw from West Virginia, and the Penn State defense wasn't ready for it. They'll never admit that, but that's what I saw. Now, having said that, I never got the sense that there was any panic whatsoever in the Penn State defense or the coaching staff or anybody. In fact, if you looked at James Franklin's body language throughout that game, even after bad plays, he was very calm. We've seen him on the sideline when they've been down at times. I don't want to say losing his cool, but being much more animated, and that was not there. He was very cool. And Tom Allen, you know what Tom Allen's going to be. He's going to be Mr. Cool all the time. And I think the players took their cue from the coaches. So that part of it was a good thing. But listen, as Daniel mentioned, if you play that way against USC, you're not going to be down by 10. I mean, you're going to be down by 21. So maybe that's a lesson learned. We're not going to know, but you can't take anybody lightly. I actually wrote that. Well, you can't take Kent State lightly after they lost to St. Francis, but beyond that, you can't take anybody else on the schedule lightly. And maybe that's a lesson learned.
In the first half, Bowling Green quarterback Connor Bazelak, 16 of 20 passing, 192 yards, 2 touchdowns. After halftime, 9 of 19 passing, 62 yards, 2 interceptions. When you talk about the entire group as a whole producing yards and points for Bowling Green, 24 points, 286 yards before halftime. After intermission, Bowling Green produces 3 points, 86 yards, and just one more first half for second half comparison, which I think when you look back beyond Bazelak's sharp start to this game, he was so sharp, but they were getting chunk plays on the ground to back him up and set up really manageable down and distance situations. Penn State was gashed for 6.3 yards per rush in the first half. That number was down to 2.5 yards per rush in the second half. So, Daniel, with that in mind, they didn't have KJ Winston at all in the second half. He was injured early in this game. We don't know the extent of the injury. We don't know the specifics of the injury, but the reigning Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week was sidelined. He didn't have his helmet with him. That meant a lot more Jalen Reed playing back deep in more of a traditional safety set with Zakee Wheatley. It meant more linebackers, 3 sets involved. It had a domino effect. We saw more Elliott Washington. There was a trickle down from the KJ Winston absence. And to Penn State's credit, although it looked really sloppy in the first half trying to work their way through that, they were able to get to the finish line without kind of, as Mark said, being frantic or panicked.
One last thing to Mark's point about that is that I think that's where the quote unquote taking a team lightly can maybe help you a little bit, where I think that there was just sort of a confidence about this team. Maybe it was slightly misplaced in hindsight that they were going to win no matter what happened, that they knew they were the better team. I know that you have to figure out how to square that and maybe channel that type of energy so you get that complete 60-minute performance. But that was something that struck me too. I mean, I know that some people had issue with how players were carrying themselves in certain situations, losing to Bowling Green. But I think that that's where the mindset of this team was that we are going to win. Even if we're down 10 points, we know we're going to win. And so I think that that's something that stood out to me a little bit. I think that you want to figure out how to have that confidence, but not have it be taking a team in that way and ending up in that kind of situation. I guess not making it overconfidence, but I think that this is a defense that, especially that I think can play with some swagger and has a view of itself, and that can come through here and there, and maybe backfire on you a little bit. But I do think, though, with losing KJ Winston, I think that changed the personnel on the back end. And I think it offered us a look into the depth chart and how Penn State feels about a couple different position groups. We have heard a lot of really good things about the safety room, but I think that when they talk about the safety room and how good it is, I think that just means the top 3 guys. When KJ Winston went out, it was a whole bunch of Cam Miller in the slot, a whole bunch of 3 cornerbacks on the field for the rest of the game pretty much. You had it where it was only Jalen Reed and Zachy Wheatley and KJ Winston as the 3 safeties who played. And so Penn State leaned on their cornerback depth a little bit more. We know that they have all those cornerbacks. We know that they want to play all of them. We know all of that, but I think that this was a really stark example of that, and having that sort of trickle down, I think, really stood out to me.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that there was more kind of a traditional defensive look and 3 linebackers. It was more of a traditional kind of nickel package look like we've been accustomed to, where you've got a cornerback type playing in the slot. And Kim Miller was doing that, playing in the box a bit too. On the course of the day, Miller was targeted quite a bit more than the other cornerbacks, surrendered a bit more. He had a PI on the day. He got to start. He played a lot. And we're going to talk about the cornerbacks because Jalen Kimber, although he didn't start, he also played a ton. But safety room and linebacker room on an afternoon when we spent a lot of time projecting how many bodies will be out there and all the young players we get a chance to evaluate in the second half of a blowout win over Bowling Green. Well, that got all dashed in a hurry. But even with, the pressure being on with Jalen Reed being removed from that line role because of KJ Winston's absence at safety, we didn't see them go beyond those top 4 at linebacker. And that's what we saw at West Virginia. It was Tyler Elsdon as kind of that next man up, and then it was Dom DeLuca, Kobe King, and Tony Rojas. And in this case, Kobe King and Tony Rojas, they were defensive mainstays. That's what we think they're going to be. We've been talking about that really throughout the offseason. They're going to be 2 guys that don't leave the field much. On this day, Dom DeLuca missed some action because of injuries. He also just wasn't as involved as they were going with that 4-2-5 look and having that extra defensive back on the field. But Mark, I think that says a lot about their comfort level, that lack thereof in terms of depth. We've seen Tyler Elsdon play a lot of football. He was a starter for all 13 games in 2022. He was a primary backup last year. He's clearly a primary backup this year. But anybody else in that room is still waiting their turn. Tamir Robinson was the guy that we anticipated we would have seen get some run last week, get some run this week. He was injured in kickoff coverage week 1 against West Virginia. He was ruled out for the week 2 matchup against Bowling Green. We'll keep tabs on him coming out of the bye week, but there was no Dakari Nelson. There was no Anthony Specca. And all it was those 4 linebackers. And ultimately, the body of work on this particular day against Bowling Green was not all that pretty for this unit.
And that's the trickle-down effect of not playing maybe as well as you should have. If you're ahead by more in this game, I'm sure those younger players would have gotten out there on the field and gotten some of that experience. This bye week, I hate where it is, but for a guy like Tamir, I think it's at a really good time. Not sure how serious his injury is, but having the extra time could only help to get him back. And I think they're going to need somebody else as the season goes along. I mean, I talked about how well they played against the run against West Virginia, but as the grind of the season goes along and there's bumps and bruises and you're going to encounter some teams who run the ball a lot, you're going to need a little bit more depth there, especially, I mean, you're going to need more depth at safety too. So you're looking at 2 key spots up the middle where, you're not maybe as deep as you would like to be. So that's definitely a concern, I think, moving forward. And I'm sure they're hoping that this bye week allows some guys to get better. KJ Winston, it was interesting because after the game I was on the field and he seemed fine. So I don't know, I'm guessing that maybe that was a concussion type thing. I don't know. He was on the sideline throughout the game, smiling and laughing and joking. So it didn't look like it was some sort of devastating injury, knock on wood. But he's obviously a very key part to what they do, and having him back again, the bye week, if it is a concussion, again, we don't know, but if that is what it is, the bye week will obviously help him.
We knew that because of the moving pieces and some of the subtractions at linebacker, it looked a lot different than what we thought it might. This depth chart coming together with Abdul Carter at defensive end. He got a couple reps at the second level back in his old stomping grounds, but they were very, very limited reps against Bowling Green. He largely was playing defensive end, and we'll get to more on him in a moment. But when you look at the linebacker group and you dash off some of the names, Cam Wiley's still sidelined, Kavion Key's no longer part of the equation, and now Tamir Robinson sidelined with his own injury issue. Then you're starting to say, well, what does that mean for the other guys? We knew Rojas and King were due for a big step. But think about Dom DeLuca, somebody who played about 250 snaps last year. He's already to 70 snaps through a couple of games. When you think about Tyler Elsdon, and I know he played a ton of football a couple of years ago as a starter, but last year he was under 200 snaps. Right now, he's at about 40 snaps. So these are a couple guys pacing for more volume than they've been experienced. We figured that might be the case for Dom DeLuca, but this is the next challenge for Dom DeLuca. If he, in this great story as an underdog coming in as a walk-on, to go from a walk-on to a special teams contributor to a special teams captain to defensive depth piece to a defensive two-deep guy, and now being asked to be more of a versatile component and more of a out there frequently kind of defensive piece. And then Elsdon as going from a guy that, nice to have that veteran in the room to now he is the next man up. And so, Daniel, when you sort through that and you look at the safety room, and you mentioned this, even with Winston not available, not another safety played on Saturday. It was the top three guys. You didn't see Dejon Lane get in, the freshman that has gotten special teams action. He's going to burn his red shirt. You didn't see Tyrese Mills or anyone else who's been around the program. And so those two spots in particular, Daniel, what do you think about the agenda moving forward? We know the identities of the headliners, but doesn't it feel like when you get into the ground and pound week to week of Big Ten play, there's just got to be more bodies and there's got to be more guys getting seasoning?
The linebacker depth definitely stands out right now. I think that you do wonder what this rotation would look like if you have a healthy Keon Wiley, if Tamir Robinson is available. How much would they be playing? How would they fit into the equation? But the one thing that coming out of Saturday and looking at the snap counts that stood out to me in terms of only playing 4 linebackers, only playing 3 safeties, kind of reminds me of in basketball when you get into the postseason and you shorten your rotation because that's what the circumstances of the game are. And that's something that coming out of Saturday, I think stuck with me a little bit, is that you play all these games to win. I think that that's the end goal. I know that we talked a lot about getting guys development, seasoning, all of that stuff. And while that might be the plan going in for a team, they got to win. So they're going to go with whoever they think is going to help them. And I think that this is illustrative to see the level of trust that they have in these different players. And when we're making our depth chart every week, we know who the guys are going to be. I do think that, especially linebacker, you would like to see more than 4 in a game and have more than 4 playable ones, especially when you factor in that I think Tony Rojas is an ascendant player. I think Kobe King is still ascendant, but I think that he ascended, especially down the stretch last year. But then with DeLuca and Elsdon, I think you sort of know what you have there. I think especially Elsdon, 5th-year guy, got his chance to start 2 years ago. I think that you know what he is. And I think that when you have a player like that out there, you know what you're going to get. The other team knows what they're going to get too. So I think with DeLuca and Elsdon, that you do, I don't want to say you worry about it, but it's a factor there in terms of these, or you know what they are, you know what they can do. Some of it is good. DeLuca, I think, has that nose, that knack for being around the football and making plays. But I think that, that there's not as much upside there potentially as if you had a Keon Wiley out there, a Tamir Robinson, 2 guys that you could consider to be ascendant players as well.
The snap counts are over at Lions247.com. We had our weekly Sunday breakdown of those, and something that stood out along those lines, just like you said, you can kind of see who the staff trusts and feels like they can count on when the game is in the balance. We thought the game wouldn't be in the balance for a solid chunk on Saturday. We were wrong. And right now, very much unlike last year, I think they got through the first couple games and the snap count distribution was insane. It felt like everybody was getting a chance to play. We are not to that point yet. Can that happen after the bye week against Kent State? I'm sure the Nittany Lions would love for it to. Mark, looking at the cornerback position, we've spent a lot of time saying it could be this guy, it could be that guy. James Franklin told us last week, don't wrap your arms around any particular starting duo because it could be different week to week. And we saw that. It was Cam Miller opposite of A.J. Harris this time around after it was both transfers, Harris and Kimber, in the starting lineup at West Virginia. Didn't matter much for Jalen Kimber. He was just as active as Cam Miller and Harris on the day. Cam Miller ended up playing a lot inside. We discussed what Jalen Reed having to move back to safety because of KJ Winston's injury meant for that cornerback room. But along the way, we also saw Elliott Washington step up, play a lot more on the perimeter. Had a feeling that might come to fruition because of James Franklin picking a couple spots last week to really get some public praise about the way Washington played. He had a late interception at West Virginia, really impressing the staff with his special teams coverage abilities as well. But Aldavian Collins still working in the background at that position largely. Zion Tracy got a little bit of a nibble, largely playing inside in that kind of slot line kind of role. But Mark, where are you with the cornerback group now? Coming out of a few weeks, it wasn't a pretty scene for them in the first half. The safeties and I think the linebackers take the brunt of the blame when you rewatch that a little bit. But when you're getting passed all over like that, the cornerback room is not absolved of much. And when you look at kind of at least the way PFF tagged these guys, Kim Miller was on the receiving end of a lot of those targets and completions, more disproportionately than the other defensive backs. But it's a tricky thing to gauge at the cornerback spot because you are so dependent upon other guys getting their job done as well.
Yeah, I mean, the other part is that they're not getting as much of a pass rush, and I get that the kid was getting rid of the ball very quickly, but you're sitting there with 2 sacks through 2 games. I mean, I think everybody would have expected more, and that's going to make life more difficult for these cornerbacks. I'm just saying that in defense of them, but it sure looks, Tyler, as if they're in a situation where they effectively have 3 first-team cornerbacks. I mean, you look at the snaps for Miller, Kimber, and Harris, all 48, 49 snaps, playing about the same amount. Obviously, that's impacted a little bit by KJ Winston not being out there. But I think between those 3, they're going to be good enough at that position. But I really believe that they're going to need more of a pass rush to give these guys a little bit of a chance against the better opponents as they come up.
Mark, I would maybe start to include Elliott Washington in that conversation as well, as guys who could pop up as starters. Davian Collins was the guy that everyone was going out of their way. Even James Franklin in Indianapolis, when he was asked by national people, was saying this is the guy that has the most buzz. Now, there was preseason camp. We know that he didn't necessarily go and light the world on fire every single day, if we're to the point now that he's got about 19 total snaps through a couple games. But we know the cornerback room is going to make it an uphill battle for a lot of dudes. I don't know. What do you think about this? Because Daniel, when we say Cam Miller's involvement, I do wonder if things go according to plan. You've got KJ Winston available for you for the duration of this. Is it a lot of Washington and Harris pairings and Washington and Kimber pairings and maybe less of Cam Miller out there? I think that's tricky because he got juiced up a little bit by his role in the slot in terms of snap counts. And at the same time, Elliott Washington seems to be knocking on the door for more involvement.
There's a ton of different pieces, and I think this is just really going to shift every week. Sort of what James Franklin was saying to echo him, that don't get married to these different different combinations. I do think it was a bit of a shaky outing for Cam Miller. I think that as sort of a role player these past couple of years, he was a very, very steady presence out there when he would sub in. And I think that, maybe he might be more suited to the outside, maybe that they need to find the right combination for him. All of those different sorts of things. I think that, they'll have to find the right fit for him where he can't get picked on when he's out there, or, he just needs to make the plays. I know that makes it really, really simple to say, but, I do think that Elliott Washington has really popped these past 2 weeks. I know that the interception last week was in garbage time, game out of reach, but that's someone who's still playing hard. But I thought when he was on the field on Saturday against Bowling Green, you really noticed him. And I think given what we've heard about him as an athlete in terms of the type of speed that he has, I know that when he first got here, he was up over 200 pounds, a little bit more of a physical corner. He's down, I think, in the 190s now weight-wise. But even then, you look at him and he just seems very, very solidly built. So he's someone that I'd be really intrigued about getting more run, getting more reps. I think that when we forecasted in December, look before the transfer portal opened, before Kimber and Harris came in, and you looked ahead to this year, I think that you had a lot of reasons to be excited about Elliott Washington and to see him get a lot of run this year. Granted, in week one, that wasn't necessarily the case with the job that Harrison Kimber did and coming out there as the top guys. But now that we're in week two, we've seen a little bit more of him. I'd be really curious to see what his role looks like moving forward. But I came away impressed with him. I think he's a cornerback with physical gifts that allow him to do a lot of different things. And I think now it's on Terry Smith and Tom Allen to pair up these corners and find the three. If you need to put three out there, find the right three. If it's only two, find the right two for whatever situation, whatever opponent will work, and that can get you the results that you need on that back end.
We have heard some pretty glowing reports about Elliott Washington, his work on the practice field since he showed up to campus last year. And I think one of the more interesting descriptions I've heard is that he generates as much horsepower as anybody on this roster. I thought that was a good way to put it, because he's not just a fast guy moving down the field. He's a fast, physical guy moving down the field. So more to watch in this cornerback room. I wouldn't sleep on Zion Tracy. And oh, by the way, they got 3 freshman cornerbacks trying to do what they can each and every week to work their way up the conversation. Before we get over to some offensive takeaways here, just to spotlight a couple of things there. Mark, we spent some time on the postgame podcast reviewing Tony Rojas's afternoon. I thought he was fantastic in downfield coverage. He was the first to admit after the game that he has work to do cleaning up his tackling technique during this bye week. But his ability to put himself in positions to make the tackles downfield and that to make plays in the pass game. He made up a lot of ground on that breakup, and that was when it felt like Bowling Green was completing everything. Thought that was an important moment for him to get the breakup downfield. Of course, he comes up with one of those 2 late interceptions as well. And then I'm just going to throw this your way too. Abdul Carter seemed to find a bit of a groove in his second game at defensive tackle. He had 7 tackles, 1 of them for loss. He had a pass breakup in the backfield that nipped a little bit of momentum out for Bowling Green when that was really important. And I thought overall just more disruptive. I think he had a couple pressures, a QB hurry. So 2 defensive players there that when you're looking on a relatively quiet or disappointing day for that unit, those guys to me had a little bit of that momentum swinging to them.
Yeah, the one thing we heard about Rojas in the preseason was that he has a natural ability to get to the ball wherever it is, or the ball carrier, however you want to put it, whether it's a running back, running through a hole. His issue isn't with getting to the running back; it's with wrapping up, and that's something as a young player that he'll just get better and better and better at. But to be able to do the stuff downfield that he does is something else. I mean, he is going to be a big-time player, high school running back, skill guy, very fast, came in at 205, 210 pounds, and now he's up to 240, whatever. He is going to be the real deal. And then we had a chance to talk to him after the game, and I thought he carried himself very well. As you said, admitting to some of the things that he didn't do well, acknowledging the things that he needs to work on. So very mature guy for a young player. I have zero worries about Abdul Carter. I know people look at the stats and think, hey, what's going on there? As the season goes along and he gets more comfortable, he's going to be fine. And I think I mentioned this before the season started. Now that that second half, he seemed to reach that comfort level. Just wait and see what Tom Allen does with him. We saw some glimpses out there in that game, but when they're in tighter games, they're going to be putting him all over the field, and he's too good of a player not to be successful. He's going to be just fine. Do not worry about him. Great athlete, big, fast, strong, smart. And I think with Tom Allen, Allen is going to put him in positions to be extremely successful.
They had him attacking some interior gaps as well, not just off the edge. We've seen him do that in the linebacker spot. And I'll just add this because we get an opportunity to go and speak with these guys after matchups. And defensively, there was a little bit of a punch to the gut compared to where this team's confidence level was before the game. So to speak with guys like Rojas and Abdul Carter was helpful after the game. And I thought Carter, to me in particular, the way he spoke about Tom Allen, the way he spoke about taking accountability defensively for what happened, the way they regrouped in the second half, how they want to move forward as a unit, what his role is going to be there. It was just a lot more of Abdul Carter being ingrained within the defensive plan than I remember. I feel like he's always been such a gifted talent, but kind of in the background a little bit when we're on the peripheral, when we're talking about who are the heart and soul players for this defense and a day-to-day basis. I think he has really stepped up in that regard. I think guys are looking toward him more often than they were in the past. And thus far, I think he's really, I mean, James Franklin spoke to his maturation process this year, and there's been some challenges, and he's worked himself to a different level. And I think that was reflected in how he kind of responded to some of the questions he received after this game. And I think it's good because he's not young anymore, but he's kind of young in terms of being exposed to this kind of a spotlight versus just being the young player who would go about his business during the game, rack up a bunch of numbers, and then wouldn't really have to deal with the media because he was a freshman or he wasn't really a leader member of that defense. And Daniel, I just think that's a good development for this defense if Abdul Carter is becoming more of that kind of a presence.
Definitely. I know that it's not something that's true of every player, and it doesn't work out like this all the time, but I do think it makes things easier within a team when the best players are the best leaders. I think that that's something that we've talked a little bit about with Drew Aller in terms of we know that you have a lot of responsibility on the field, but when you're doing things both on the field and off the field, I think it helps the team as a whole. So I think if you have Abdul Carter being a focal point of this defense on the field, shouldering a lot of responsibilities, but then off the field, setting a tone, being a good presence, I think that that's something that can help everyone and really lift everyone up. Like Mark said, I mean, I'm really curious and excited for what this looks like when he gets rolling. I think that I am surprised by the sack numbers at this point. Given the confidence that I had in Abdul Carter and Deni Dennis Sutton and this defense as a whole as pass rushers. I think that there's going to be games this year where you are going to need to get that opposing quarterback on the ground. When you think about Ohio State, when you think about USC, you are going to need these big game-changing plays. I know that, defensive coordinators and coaches, they love to talk about all the different things a player can do and all the different things a defense can do to affect a quarterback in terms of hurries and hits and all these different things. But I think that sacks, getting that quarterback on the ground, forcing them to lose yardage and a down, generating that kind of momentum, I think that it's something that can't really be overstated. And there's going to be games where Penn State is going to need to get these quarterbacks on the ground. There's going to be a juncture in a game where an incompletion would be great. It would help you get off the field, but getting that sack can be something totally different, something transformative for your team. So we'll see what that looks like. And if Penn State can generate, not only the disruption, but getting the results from the disruption.
Circling back to Tyler Warren and the game that he had, which was one of its kind in terms of Penn State's tight end legacy, a record for that position with 146 receiving yards, 8 catches on 8 targets, 7 of them resulted in first downs. I said this on the post-game podcast, but he's now at 8 consecutive games by the way, at 6'6", 260 pounds, where he's got at least one catch of 14 yards in that contest. And through these 2 matchups, Warren leads all non-quarterbacks in skill position snaps for the offense. We knew he'd be important, but you start to look at the snap counts. You look over at the stat sheet. He's got more than double the amount of catches of anyone else on this team right now, 11 of them, 176 yards and a score. He's averaging 16 yards per catch for these first couple games. And Mark, I think it's fair to say that he is validating James Franklin's comments about being a complete tight end, an elite level complete tight end. He was involved in clearing out that left side for Nick Singleton to run 41 yards in the game-clinching touchdown. But beyond Tyler Warren, we've got feels like a week-to-week roller coaster ride and what's brewing at tight end. The depth is great there, but it's being challenged. Andrew Rapplier was on the sideline. He was in crutches, something that happened at the tail end of last week. We're going to ask James Franklin more about that when we get on the field Tuesday, but it doesn't look good when a guy's on crutches, and so we're monitoring that. Khalil Dinkins was back, but he was the number 3 guy behind Luke Reynolds, who got a start in his second career college game. He's the first freshman to start for the Nittany Lions since 2022, when about 4 or 5 guys did that. So throwing it a lot to you at the tight end position, it's Tyler Warren and company, but that company's been hard to get a read on. Seems like the 5-star is on the rise.
Yeah, it's been weird because the last few years I've always had those 2 kind of complementary tight ends, guys, whether it was Strange and Theo or Theo and Warren. And it's just somebody's going to have to step up at this point. I mean, with Rapp, it looks like that's going to be a long-term type of thing. I mean, we don't know for sure. Hopefully we get some clarity on that when we have an opportunity to talk to James Franklin. We're recording this on Monday. Hopefully we get clarity when we talk to James Franklin Tuesday after practice and can find out what the situation is. You hope it's not significant, but if it is, yeah, I mean, Reynolds is a guy who has come in and everybody's saying all the right things about him. I think they were fortunate that they were able to get him in mid-year. He's been able to bulk up and carry the size that he's going to need to play that position in the Big Ten. But Warren talked about this, and I think Aller talked about it, the level of maturity from Reynolds to come in and be able to handle his business the way he needs to handle his business as a true freshman to put himself in position to play. And I wouldn't sleep on Dinkins. I mean, how many snaps did he have him for here? I have
He had eight snaps.
Yeah, and I don't think we expected a whole heck of a lot out of him because we had not seen him in practice for multiple weeks, and you just don't put him in there and give him 30 snaps. So
third down conversion, though. I mean, every time this guy gets a pass, it's either moving the chains or reaching the end zone.
All he does is catch touchdowns. I keep saying it, which was actually a flattering thing for Chris Carter, though some people didn't view it that way. But yeah, I mean, I think he's going to be a guy who you're going to see emerge and do some things. And I think we would have seen more of him if he weren't banged up. So generally speaking, I think they're going to be fine there. Just because you have Tyler Warren playing it at such a high level. And you talk about kind of validating the stuff that James Franklin said about him. Remember back at the Combine when Theo was out there and Daniel Jeremiah didn't even know the guy's name. He goes, yeah, Penn State has another tight end, number 44, who's probably going to be even better. I'm paraphrasing, but he really pops on tape. I can only imagine what NFL scouts are thinking now that they've seen him elevate his game to a different level. And the other thing I'd say about Tyler Warren, low-key guy, but you can see, and Tyler, you talked about this after the bowl game, where he was one of the guys that they identified, hey, go out and talk to the media. And he started to emerge as a leader then and really carries himself as a leader now. Understated, not over the top, not in your face, but just the way he's able to communicate on behalf of the team, he's doing a really good job.
Yeah, great mentor for those young tight ends, and they need that right now. And I'm including Khalil Dinkins in that conversation because in terms of game snaps, he's still fairly young, but he's an older guy now, redshirt junior. And I think you're right. You get him back, get that rust knocked off on the practice field, then in a game, and even get him a catch, get him tackled, have a feel around him of what it's like to be in the game. Now you get a bye week, and he's the guy we really got to watch here, and we are bracing ourselves for, negative news on Rapley, I think, more than we're anticipating positive news in that situation because of the circumstances, which is unfortunate because like Tamir Robinson, this is somebody who all preseason camp, everyone's saying, he's ready to take the next step. He's ready to take the next step, and you got to pause it. And with Rapley, considering where that position was going into this matchup, it felt like even this past Saturday could have been a good chance for him to break out a bit. But we'll keep tabs on that. Again, we'll be back on the practice field Tuesday. There's a few names we've got to get to with James Franklin coming out of this matchup. And before we turn our attention to just a couple storylines we're monitoring this week, Daniel, elsewhere in the passing attack, receivers, while Tyler Warren was running rampant everywhere, you've got 3 catches, 37 yards, and a touchdown among that receiver room. Omari Evans had 34 of those yards. He had the touchdown as well. Julian Fleming had 1 catch for 3 yards. But we didn't see Harrison Wallace pop up in the box score. You saw Liam Clifford get a lot of run again, 35 snaps, but he didn't see a target. He's seen about 60 to 65 snaps on the season without getting a target. But he's only been out there, as it turns out, for about 18 pass plays. And then you throw in Omari Evans. It felt like he had maybe the busiest day, and certainly had the busiest day at receiver. But despite starting, he played 20 snaps, which was pretty far and away 4th behind Fleming, Clifford, and Wallace. So what do you think you've learned, and what would you like to know about the plan at receiver through the first 120 minutes of football?
I think the one thing that we would like to know or learn is when some of these guys are going to get, I think, fully healthy. We know that Clifford missed a little bit of time during camp. We know that Caden Saunders missed a little bit of time during camp, and we haven't seen him out there for an offensive snap yet this year. We've only seen him in that special teams role. So after the bye week, what can you get out of those guys a little bit more? I do think that Liam Clifford is going to have to be out there at a point when they are passing. I think that you run the risk when you laid out that disparity with the number of snaps that he's played, how many of them have been in the run game, how many have been in the pass game. I think that that's a trend that I think when you self scout, maybe you can hone in on and figure out how to even that distribution a little bit as a tell. So I think those are two things going into the bye week that I'm interested in. But I think overall, even when you put that final line there, 3 catches, 37 yards, and a touchdown, I still feel encouraged about the passing game. I still feel encouraged about the wide receivers. I think you look at the process that we saw on Saturday over the results that we got. You took that deep shot to Trey Wallace that the ball hung up just a little bit. There was also an out to Trey Wallace for a first down that was wiped out by a Drew Shelton holding call. I think when Drew Aller threw that ball, I think I said an expletive in the press box just because it was that type of throw. And then with Omari Evans, you have the drop on another really nice play by Drew Aller. And then you have the OPI for Omari Evans that took a touchdown off the board. So right there, you've got 4 plays, 2 that don't technically count because they were penalties. They get wiped out in the box score, where you saw the process of what this offense is trying to do, what this passing game can do, and what its mentality is. And I think that you take away that Drew Shelton holding call, you take away that Omari Evans drop, maybe you take away the OPI too, things look a lot different there. So you are graded on your results, and that is the thing that is in the box score. We look at the final score at the end of every game. Like I said, don't hang banners for covering the spread or keeping a game close. So you need to make those plays. You need to be clean. You need to avoid those miscues. But I think that the process that we've seen and what has gone into this passing game, I don't necessarily come out of this with a lot of concern. And that's before even factoring in Drew Aller only threw the ball 20 times. He's thrown the ball 37 times in 2 games. We've gone over how many options there are on this offense, how many guys you need to get involved. I don't think that this will necessarily be we're not going to see someone with like a Jahan Dotson 2021 type year. As much as you'd like to see Trey Wallace do that, Tyler, when all is said and done, I'm not sure we'll see that, and that's just product of this offense.
Yeah, I think you said this during the postgame podcast, 37 pass attempts for Drew Aller through this first couple of matchups with Andy Kotelnicki as offensive coordinator. He was over 37 pass attempts in 3 different games last season over the course of that year, first year as starter. Just a couple other tidbits at wide receiver I wanted to reference. Tyler Johnson was involved the second straight game. He didn't see any offensive snaps for his first couple of years on campus. So the fact that he's getting some run, although very limited, it tells you a little bit about his elevation in terms of the depth chart at the moment. But I also have a question with Caden Saunders. This is back-to-back weeks where he was strictly utilized as a punt returner. He was not used on offense. We know the plan was for him to be a weapon on offense, especially out of that slot coming into the season, but derailed a bit and during an August injury issue, and it just doesn't seem like he's all the way back. That's another thing that is he somebody who's going to be a factor and a potential spark on offense, because to this point hasn't been given that run, and I think it's probably because they are walking a fine line between him being fully healthy enough to play right receiver a bunch and fully healthy enough to be the security at the back end of that punt coverage, of that punt unit, although we saw him lose control of the ball and nearly lose possession of the ball last week. And just this is an interesting one. Clifford and Fleming, they're about 125 snaps combined so far in the season. 1 collective target between the 2 of them. That was the 3-yard catch for Fleming last Saturday. So those guys have been on the field a bunch, but they haven't made that impact on the stat sheet. And I know people are kind of focusing in on the stat sheets when it comes to receiver. We got a note, Mark, that not only do you have Tyler Warren going off with a historic day at tight end, but the receivers also aren't going to be in the spotlight when you've got two 100-yard rushers at your disposal, and Nick Singleton adding a touchdown catch along the way. We wondered if Kaytron Allen, and I think all three of us leaned toward him getting right in game 2 after averaging 2 yards per carry in the season opener. He got right in a big way against West Virginia, did his business. And when you go back to the second half of that West Virginia game, they carried the ball 28 times for 173 yards after halftime in week 1. That's 6.28 or 6.2 yards per carry. And on the course of this game, 4 quarters collectively, Penn State 234 rushing yards. They averaged per rush 6.3. So you look at the last 6 quarters of work, and I know that fourth quarter against West Virginia, a little bit out of hand, but this is an offense that is showing it can run the ball and produce explosive plays. And they may have been able to run the ball on occasion last year, but the explosive play component was not part of the process.
Yeah, and that was up over 7 yards when you adjust for sacks. But, the bottom line, guys, we're through 2 games, and they're averaging 228 yards per game rushing and 220 yards per game passing. That is exactly what you're looking for. I mentioned this in a different media thing that I did earlier today, but it occurred to me that, I mentioned last week that we saw Kaytron Allen at the end of the West Virginia game kind of sitting on the bench and, looked like he was down a little bit, people coming over, kind of slapping him on the back. These guys have to get over that, because there are going to be games when somebody who has had big games, and this week it was Trey Wallace, right? So he has his breakout game at West Virginia, and then he's essentially a non-factor, Daniel's notes notwithstanding. I mean, so that there's nothing wrong with that. So long as somebody's getting the job done, it's perfectly fine if you have Kaytron Allen rush for 170 yards and Singleton rushes for 30, or vice versa, or Tyler Warren goes off. This game, you just so happened to have Tyler Warren, Singleton, and Kaytron all go off. But what did that come at the expense of? Not as much production from the receivers. The bottom line is, how many yards are you producing as an offense? And I think that's the sign of a good offense, where one of your key players may not go off, and you're still chugging out yards. I mean, the job they did on first down in that game, it was insane. They averaged over 10 yards per first down play. They had 30 first down plays for over 300 yards. I mean, that's an offense operating at kind of a different level. So I think the offense is just fine, and it's only going to get better as everybody gets more used to it, whether it's rushing, whether it's passing, no matter who the star is in a given week.
James says he wants more plays, but at the same time, if you're producing more per play,
Right,
that's going to leave you with less, right? And so they're trying to find the balance between those two things. I'll note that after going 20 yards on 10 carries in West Virginia, Kaytron Allen's first carry of the game on Saturday went for 26. So he kind of just knocked that to the side real fast in the afternoon. And Nick Singleton now, 40 plus yard rushes this season. He's got 3 of them. A reminder that last year, 13 games, his longest run was 24 yards. So Nick Singleton is back in a big way if you were looking for that kind of a return. One more note on the
Tyler, both guys with the receiving touchdown too. Don't sleep on that. I mean, that's a big thing for those running backs.
Yeah, and they did it in different ways. I think Nick Singleton showed his skill as a receiver, grabbing that rope from Drew Aller on the sideline, and then Kaytron Allen showed, I don't need a long pass to get me to the end zone on 20 yards. He did a lot of that work on his own. Nolan Rucci, I think we may have mentioned this on the postgame podcast, but certainly by design was more of a component on the offensive side. He played a little bit at both tackle positions, more so at the right tackle spot at the expense of starter Anthony Donko. And then we saw some 6 offensive line sets where he was utilized. We kind of projected this in the preseason that he might be that swing tackle to step up and add an extra body up there. So Nolan Rucci, the Wisconsin transfer, former 5-star player, also took a step forward in this offense in week 2. Getting through some storylines, Daniel, there's going to be immediate focus on KJ Winston and Andrew Rappleyea because those are right in front of us. We just witnessed those things. But I think this is going to be a good week for us, hopefully, to maybe get a fresh update on guys like Jackson Smolik at quarterback, who we certainly saw as active as we have seen during his pregame warmups. He was in uniform, although he was already ruled out for the game. Redshirt freshman quarterback, sidelines in spring ball. And then a couple guys that we haven't seen out there, not in uniform, not in the practice field, but, kind of standing around and supporting their teammates. Keon Wiley at linebackers, Uriah Fisher at defensive end. We got another bye week to get to later on, but these are kind of the housekeeping things on our list here. Maybe we'll get a little bit of light shed, maybe we won't, but there are a few names kind of out there that we have some uncertainty around their availability.
I know that the early bye week messes up the rhythm a little bit, and I don't necessarily like it, but I think that it's good to get a progress report on some of these things that maybe fall a little bit by the wayside as you are finishing up camp and everything is gearing up to week 1, and all the focus is on that. And now we get an early chance to step back a little bit and see where some of these players are, because all 3 of the guys that you mentioned occupy spots on the depth chart, and especially Wiley and Fisher. Those are guys at positions where your depth is, maybe not where you want it to be, or in the case of linebacker, potentially compromised. So if we can get a progress report, when could these guys come back? Where are they in their rehab? We know that whatever we get from James Franklin, it probably won't be super specific, which is his right. But any sort of insight, I think, would be interesting. And then I think Jackson Smolik to know where he is, because we've seen him ramp up gradually. We know that Penn State and James Franklin, they, even with the pregame availability report and all that, they like to use game days to keep guys on their rehab schedule. We saw it last year when they took Chop Robinson to Maryland as an extra player, even though he wasn't going to play, so that he could get work, check off that day on the rehab schedule, keep on track. Smolik seems like he is progressing every time that we've seen him, and it seems like he's doing a little bit more. And especially we didn't see Ethan Grunkemeyer on Saturday. So, your Jack Lambert was a couple heartbeats away.
Yeah.
So I think that, the depth at some of these positions can disappear so quickly. So if these guys are on the mend, if you can get Smolik back and have him be an option, James Franklin has been really complimentary of him through this whole process. We'll see.
I'm glad you mentioned Grunkemeyer, the freshman who was the recipient of a lot more snaps than he probably thought he'd get, because Smolik being sidelined for so long going back to spring. You're right. He was listed as questionable, and just checking, we did not see him participate in those pregame warmups, correct?
Correct. I didn't see him.
Yeah. Okay. I did not either. So we'll get eyes on this team again Tuesday. And with that in mind, and full coverage coming your way at Lions247.com on Tuesday night. We're a day earlier on the practice field than we are during normal game weeks, which will be Wednesdays. But we'll have a practice report. We'll have a photo gallery. We'll have James Franklin available to us when we come off the field. And with that in mind, guys, again, we don't have a game to preview, but let's finish with this. In terms of questions that have been answered and questions that haven't, I'd love to hear your thoughts on each of those topics, and we can go to you, Mark, to begin. And you're muted to start.
I'm reserving I was getting another text, and it wasn't from Dave this time, but I'm reserving my right to change this when we write it, because we haven't kind of hashed all this through. The fun of doing the pod is that we can just do this stuff live, kind of spitball it. But question answered. I think I mentioned it. The effectiveness of the offense, the balance of the offense, the whole idea of getting the ball into the hands of your best playmakers, getting the ball in space, keeping opponents off balance. We heard about that all off season, and I think mission accomplished through 2 games. I don't think it could be much better than what they've done, this early in the season, given you have a new coordinator. Unanswered question that's lingering. I'm going to go back to that wide receiver group. I know I just got done saying, no matter how you're getting it done, the idea is to score points and compile yards, but sooner or later they're going to have to get more production from the receivers, and more than just 2 receivers. If you would have told me at this point that Julian Fleming and Liam Clifford would have combined for as many tackles as targets, I would have been surprised. So I think they have to get more consistent effort across, not effort, that's the wrong word, more consistent production. The effort's there. Those guys are out there running plays, blocking, and playing hard, but more consistent production from the receivers. That was a big question mark going into the season. It's still a question mark for me.
Daniel, kind of same deal, 2-pronged approach. What are your thoughts?
In terms of answered questions, I'm going to stick with the passing game, and I think that the one thing that has been answered for us is Drew Aller's willingness, and Andy Kotelnicki's willingness, the comfort for Danny O'Brien and James Franklin to have Drew Aller take those deep shots, to have that be part of the playbook. I think that that was something that wasn't really there last year until you had the OC change at the end of the year. And I think that having that, having proof of that, seeing that, the running backs have talked about it, that that's helped them, that like there's at least the thread of it, that it's on tape, defenses have to account for it. And then I think that you had Drew Aller throw an interception on Saturday, and it was pretty rough play looking back at it in terms of locking on to Harrison Wallace and going to him no matter what, even though there are two guys there. But it was the type of thing where Aller threw that, it was bad. You're in a tight game, but it didn't really feel like the end of the world. I think in terms of the flow of the game, whereas last year it seemed like it was just so like I don't want to say walking on eggshells, but there were times when it felt like if Drew Aller threw an interception, it was going to be the end of the world and everything like that. So I thought that's something that's been a little different. In terms of unanswered questions, I think that we knew that the defense was going to be different this year. We knew that they were so historically good last year that it was going to be really hard for them to be at that same level. So I think the unanswered question is, what is the level going to be? I know last week it was kind of like, oh, maybe they are going to be able to do that again. After that first half this week, they did not look even close. So what is this defense? Where is it? It's going to be different. Um, I think that, but I think they just need to find their level. And I'm curious where that is, especially in relation to what we saw under Manny Diaz.
Yeah, I was going to go with Drew Aller letting the ball air out and not just schematically planning for that, but him showing the confidence to do it and going back to it later in games. We've seen that his average depth of target 12.5 on Saturday. It was 13.2 the week before against West Virginia. Last year, that mark was I believe under 10.
Yep.
So that's a big jump already this year. But I'll just go to my default number 2, Nick Singleton. He's back. Like I said, I mean, we just were wondering, can we trust what we saw at the very end of last year and his entire freshman year versus what we saw for those 10 games? How do we marry those two things? Sophomore slumps are legitimate across college football every year. And he's back. I mean, he is, you have to account for him as a defensive coordinator. Not that they weren't last year, but it's on film now. 3 different rushes of 40-plus yards. 2 of them have reached the end zone. He's a guy who can flip the field for you. He can change the scoreboard from anywhere on the field. There's not a lot of players like him, and now he is a burgeoning receiver threat, and we're seeing Andy Kotelnicki utilize him in some different ways. So I think to me, it's just checking that off the list. Yes, Nick Singleton is Nick Singleton, the former 5-star, the former Gatorade Player of the Year at the national level. And then I think unanswered for me is just, you got a little time here. Is more freshmen going to make their move? Are we going to see more of an influence from this class than maybe how it projects early on? Because there's 3 guys involved. I know Luke Reynolds hasn't gotten that green light, but I think considering what's happening in the tight end room and his early work, we're anticipating him to be a freshman who stays involved. But it's really only those 3. And Dejan Lane, special teams is kind of in his wheelhouse. Cooper Cousins has room to grow at offensive line. But will there be an emergence from an offensive weapon, like a Quentin Martin or a Tyseer Denmark? Will there be an emergence on the defensive side of the ball where you might have an edge rusher involved, Max Granville, or a depth piece at linebacker and Anthony Specca? And you've got 5 defensive backs along with Lane to consider back there. So for me, I'm just wondering, how can those guys be sprinkled into the conversation onto the field to give you the best shot to make the college football playoff and win games there? So I think that's something they'll probably be able to put their head underneath the hood of the car a little bit in the next week or so, do some self-inventory, which guys are ready to step up, which guys are not. And I think they'll have a better feel for how this freshman class may contribute the remaining month of September and then when Big Ten play gets going. Guys, appreciate the perspective here on a Monday coming out of a matchup. We don't have a ton of episodes coming your way between now and next week, just one more this week. But we will resume our larger scale episode format when we get back into game action. Mark, Daniel, hope you guys enjoy your Saturday away from coverage. Anything else to add before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into great depth on this, but check out our front page. We have a recruiting wrap up with visit reports from the weekend, visitor list. Say that because this is the last day of our 60% off special. So I can sit here and talk about it all you want, but it's much easier for you to just go to the front page. If you're watching this on Monday, or listening to it on Monday, go to our front page, check out the recruiting wrap up. There's quick links to all the VIP stories. If you're listening to it Tuesday, you could still subscribe for 30% off. But on Monday, 60% off, ends at midnight.
Thanks for mentioning that. Great point, and a lot of good content coming out of the recruiting coverage this weekend from Brian Doan, Tyler Calvaruso. Top 100 prospects were on campus. A lot of in-state feel to it as well. We'll have Tyler on the next episode. For now, on behalf of Daniel Gallen, Mark Brennan, our entire crew at Lions247.com, we're stepping aside. I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.